to talk about what climate change means to our river, what it means to our fish, and I'm a salmon biologist, so it's mostly what it means to our salmon. So it's not a very holistic approach, but I'm leaving that to Tim, who's going to take a more holistic approach. I'm going to be all about the salmon. And I'd like to just make the point that we're not in a happy spot. And I don't think most of the people that live in this valley realize how close we are to a real crisis. So I want to speak to that, and then I also want to speak about what we can actually do about it. So I'm going to summarize Jeff's talk in one slide. So what we're looking at is more precipitation in the winter, but no snow, right? So rains and floods in the winter, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here. More droughts in the summer, and we won't have a snowpack to help us with those. And it's no longer about when climate change is going to get here. Climate change is here, and it's not about avoiding the impacts. It's about trying to minimize them, which we haven't done a very good job on. And what I'm going to talk about is trying to mitigate, right? Like what can we do about it? So a couple of factoids. The amount of water flowing into our lake, which is related to the amount of water that flows out of it, has dropped by 1/3 since the 60s. That's a fact. We have the data set, right? That's not an opinion. The other graph, I'm sorry, I've got a couple of graphs, so I'll try not to spend a lot of time, is inflows from the 60s, from the 90s, an average of the last 30 years, and the red one is projected 30 years, using good science. So the difference we are going to see is staggering, and in the summer, if there wasn't any water leaving a lake, evaporation is going to be way more than what's flowing in. You can see that this is the zero line here. So in the summertime, the lake's going to be dropping like crazy, even if there's no water flowing out of it, right? And again, this is good science. Just like to remind you, we've had the Weir managing water since 1957, so it's almost as old as I am. The first 40 years it was there, it was always able to deliver our environmental flows, right? The water we think we need for fish and fish habitat. No failures. Every year was money in the bank. The last 5 years it's failed 4 times. So we're seeing right now what climate change means. We've had to truck salmon up the river 3 times in the last 15 years because there's not enough water for them to swim. And the projections indicate that what's a drought year this year now will be normal in 30 years. So in 30 years, it'll be normal to truck salmon up the river if we want them to. That's not a great situation to find ourselves in. So what's at risk? I have to just rant a little bit about salmon and how we take them for granted and how they are a miracle. If we were living in Munich or Missouri or Monaco and we said, yeah, I live beside a little creek that's got 113-pound fish swim up it every year, they'd think you were alive. I mean, we are tremendously gifted to live in this sort of watershed, and it's the reason that our environment is so rich is because of salmon. The last 15 years, we've averaged 150 to 200,000 chum salmon. That's 2 million pounds of biomass swims up our river every year. 2 million pounds, and it disappears. Except it doesn't, right? It's what fuels the engine. Everything from like benthic invertebrates to the trees that grow beside the river benefit from recaptured nutrients. It's a miracle, and I suggest that our miracle is at risk. Speaking a little bit about the iconic Chinook salmon, I'm sure that Tim will speak about the visceral importance of those fish to the First Nations communities. And I think as Europeans, it's hard for us to understand how important that is. Also very important for something that's getting a lot of airplay are orcas, right? The resin orca pod feeds 85% on Chinook salmon. Sometimes of the year they'll feed on kind of passing stocks, Columbia stocks, Fraser stocks. Sometimes of the year they depend on local stocks, right? They depend on our Cowichan Chinook. And we're still learning about how the water in the river affects these fish. And I want to talk really quickly, really briefly about that. So one of the things that's pretty obvious is fish need water to swim upstream, right? So, and these photos of the river, they're not photoshopped. That's what the Cowichan looks like most years now in August and September. If you're a Chinook salmon wanting to swim up there, it's pretty difficult. Right? And what happens on the north arm is they start up and they end up like in Monica's pool, right in the intertidal, and they can't get any further. And so they're very vulnerable, right, to pinnipeds, right, who kind of come in and eat them all. And it's not the seal's fault. The fish should be able to swim upstream. That's the way they've evolved, but they can't. So the rate of attrition is horrendous. It's also interesting to note that we have two runs of Chinook salmon here. We have the fall salmon, which are now the largest run. We also have a spring run of Chinook, and Lachine and Tim tell me that 2 generations ago, the spring run was the big run. Now there's probably 300, 400, maybe not even that. And what happens to those fish, they have to get up the river into the lake in the spring, right? And they spend the summer in the lake and then they spawn. When the water is low in the spring, they can't get through Reed Canyon, they can't get up Scutts Falls, they get trapped in the river goes to 25 degrees. Not a happy thing, right? So it depends, there's lots of things that affect upstream migration that are related directly to how much water is in the river. The thing we don't think about very often is the little fish moving out. And again, the amount of water in the river is crucial. Chinook salmon swim up out of the gravel as half-gram fry in early March. They show up in the estuary at 5 times that size in mid-May. So they only spend 60 to 80 days in the river, and they quintuple their size. And their survivability is directly related to that. So what happens, or where do they go for that, 60 days? We found out through recent research that they don't live anywhere. They're right up at the sides of the river in the emergent vegetation, and there's a picture there. So they're right up in the shrubs that kind of grow at the side of the river. So it's not hard to figure out what happens if the river isn't full. That habitat is not there. So they can't utilize it. So survivability is very low. And we've done pit tagging, which is a passive inducive transmitter that follows their survivability. We inject a little thing the size of a rice grain, and then we have sensors in the river that can track individual fish when they cross the sensors. What we found is, on dry years, like 2016, 4 out of 5 Chinook that leave the upper river do not even make it to the estuary. So they die before they make it to the estuary. On wet years, like 2017, it's reversed. 80% make it to the estuary. So that's hard science. So it's really easy to see the relationship between how much water is in the river and what's going on. One of the strategies, possibly, for maintaining flows in the river is, in fact, pumping water out of the lake if there's not enough to flow out by itself. Again, not as simple as you think. We have a species of lamprey that's only found in the Cowichan. I realize they're not warm and snuggly and huggable, but they're found nowhere else in the world. They live on the fluvial fans on the outflows of the river. We also have a genetically unique species of coho. Dr. Blair Holtby in the 80s and 90s did a bunch of research on our lake tributary coho. They have a different phenotype and a different genotype than coho. So they're like the average coho. They're shorter, they're deeper, they have the life history of a sockeye. So as soon as they're up out of the gravel, they swim down into the lake and they rear in the lake for a year. Mike McCullough, who's our kind of trout guy, says, you know what? Same thing with the trout. They're not pelagic feeders. They hang out in the littoral zone, in that shallow zone. So what happens if we pump the lake down? We lose that habitat. So we're going to have tremendous impacts on all the salmonids that utilize the lake. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with another graph. This is where we were a month ago. The vertical axis is the elevation of the lake, and the horizontal is the time. So you can see on a normal year there's lots of water in the spring, and then it stops raining, and we gradually feed the water out, hoping we don't hit these lines, because that's where there's no longer enough water in the lake to feed the river. And then it starts raining again in the fall. And it's a squeaky thing every year. This year, a month ago, we were here. Now it's rained a little bit, and I'll show you what that looks like. But it's not beyond the pale that we'd have another, couple months of dry weather. If that had happened, we would run out of lake storage in May. We would start pumping water out of the lake. We would pump the lake down the maximum that there's a license to do that by the 1st of July. The lake would be 2 feet lower than it's ever been. Everyone's boats would be in the mud. There would be no more water to feed the river, and it would dry out. That's this year. Now, it's rained a little bit, so it doesn't look like that, but it looks like this. So here's where we are. So you can see in the average year, the water level doesn't rise very much. Now, it could rain like hell this year, and we could be laughing. But if it's a normal year, and we start to slide down the scale, I'm a biologist, I'm not a mathematician, but you can see we're not in a very good spot. Like where that would hit the zero storage, we're maybe looking at July. And it doesn't rain a whole lot in July, August, and September. That's where we are this year. I'm just saying, right? We're not in a happy spot. One more graph. This one's different. This shows the flow in the river. So this is how much water is flowing in the river. This is the time. We have standards that we feel will provide for enough water for the ecosystem. This is this year. Look how much water we had flowing down the river in March and April, when I said you need a full river, right, to support Chinook. We don't know what that's meant, and it's rained a little, and we're kind of back up to 25. But we've already experienced some pretty grim conditions, and we don't even know what that means for us this year, but it's probably not good. So, like the snowpack graph, you've seen this before. This, though, is Heather Mountain. This is our own watershed. This isn't Jump Creek. And again, you can see we're not going to get a lot of help this year from snow. I just showed you all those boring graphs to try and reinforce that this is not something that could happen to us in the future. Every year, we're balanced on that knife edge, and we've always fallen off the right side. One of these years, it's going to be not so much. So what should we do? And this is a Band-Aid. This isn't fixing climate change. This is something we can do in our river, in our watershed. I would suggest we need to store more water in the lake so that we mimic the snowpack that we're losing. And I see 5 steps for that. We need to speak to everybody. We need a plan. That step is done. I'm going to talk to a little bit about that. Some of you were involved in that. In 2017 and 18, we had an inclusive water use planning process, and we reached a consensus, what we need to do. The next 3 steps are ongoing right now. There's a partnership which includes Cowichan Tribe, CBRD, the Watershed Board, and Paper Excellence that are developing a proposal to fund the work, to design the kind of structure we need to deliver the amount of water we need, and to do all the survey work to accurately portray what that will mean for upstream property owners. That work in itself is in 7 figures. It's millions of dollars of work. We have to identify a license holder. Someone has to assume the responsibility for storing that extra water. We're negotiating with the province and others on that right now. And finally, and we're not there yet, we need to finance and construct weirs. So I'm just saying we have a solution, but it's not a solution for tomorrow. Local partners are working hard on that right now. I think it's the way we're going to address some of the concerns I have, and I'm optimistic we're getting there. I just want to talk a little bit about the water use planning process we've been engaging in. This was an intense process, taking into account everyone's interests and concerns, and there was a tremendous amount of modeling that went on. You don't have to read this, but we spent months and months and months. Tim was involved, I know Parker was involved, and we reached a consensus, so which we never had before. So I think our community now is united. We know where we want to go, what we want to do. We've done a tremendous amount of modeling and research. One point I would make, when we did this work, we've got a 70-year data set for hydrology in the watershed. It's the most data-rich watershed on the island. We ignored it. We ignored all that data. And we used the forecast data that Jeff provided, or that Peter provided. Because we're not planning for 1960, right? We're planning for whatever, 2050 or 2080. Quickly, I want to show you one of the outcomes of the water use planning process if we don't do anything. Salmon stocks that utilize the river to spawn and rear during the summer and early fall will be decimated. And we wanted to use the word extirpated, but we couldn't really justify that because we can't say if they'll all be dead. But probably most of them will be. So the option of doing nothing is not an option. So what's the bottom line? We are facing unprecedented challenges with respect to the kind of things that I care about: the river, aquatic ecosystems, salmon. Here in the Cowichan, we have an opportunity for an intervention that can make a difference. And I'm a biologist, and for the first 25 years of my career, philosophically, my take is hands off. If we stop screwing things up, nature can fix itself. I've changed my opinion. We've screwed things up so much that we need to intervene. And I think the weir is a solution or partial for some of the problems, some of the challenges we are facing. I can see a time when there are Chinook, coho, steelhead, refugia on the east side of the island. Those watersheds that have the potential for water storage, and we know what they are: Cowichan, Nanaimo, Puntledge, Camel River, Nimkish. Those will be the homes of those species of salmon. Other rivers will have other species of salmon, but they probably won't have those. The decisions that we make now are affecting things that are really important to us. And we're making decisions now, or not making them, that are going to affect Sierra. They're not going to affect me. I'm in my, 60s? But I'm going to die in 25 years from now, and I can have a car and a TV for the rest of my life. My kids who are in their 20s, not so much. Their kids, not at all. I mean, I lose sleep over this stuff, and I'm hoping that you all lose sleep over it too. I think that's what it's going to take. Right? Thank you. That's what I had to share with you today. Thank you.